Consider this. In 13 years, one man marched with an army more than 40,000 kilometers, shattered the greatest empire of antiquity, and built a realm stretching from Greece to India. And then died at 32. And all of it collapsed within a handful of years. How did one man redraw the map of the known world faster than most people build a career? If you're curious how legends are born that live on for thousands of years, subscribe to the channel and hit like. Ahead lie 13 years that changed the course of history. But to understand how this became possible, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a time when there were no great victories yet, no world-spanning fame. Only a small kingdom on the edge of the known world. Macedonia. Today the name rings proud, but back then things were different. To the refined Greeks living in Athens and Sparta, it was a remote backwater, a land of shepherds and warriors, where kings spoke with a coarse accent, and the nobility drank and hunted more than they mused on philosophy. The Greeks looked down on the Macedonians, regarding them as half-barbarians, scarcely worthy of being called Hellenes. No great temples were raised here, and no one debated the fate of the world in the public squares. Here, people simply survived, amid harsh mountains, warlike neighbors, and endless feuds over the throne. And onto this shaky throne rises a man who will change everything. His name was Philip II, the father of the future conqueror of the world. He took a backward kingdom, and within a few years transformed it into a genuine war machine. It was Philip who forged the weapon with which his son would later conquer half the world. He reformed the army from top to bottom, turning a ragtag militia into a disciplined, professional force. His chief invention was the famous Macedonian phalanx, a dense formation of warriors armed with sarissas, long spears up to 6 meters in length. Picture it. Before you stands a wall bristling with hundreds of spear points, impossible to break head-on. The enemy ran into this forest of spears before he could ever reach a Macedonian with his own sword. This was not merely an army. It was the perfect killing machine of its time. And in this atmosphere of strength, ambition, and constant struggle for power, a boy was growing up who was destined to eclipse his father's glory. Alexander came into the world in a family where greatness was in the blood and intrigue was in the air. From earliest childhood, he watched his father defeat enemies and expand the borders. And, as legend has it, the boy would even grow upset. It seemed to him that Philip would conquer the whole world and leave his son nothing for his own feats. Even then, the ambition burned in him that would later lead him to the ends of the earth. One story from his childhood tells of the future king's character better than 1,000 words. A magnificent but utterly untamed horse named Bucephalus was brought to the court. Not one of the experienced riders could master him. The horse threw them all and shook his head wildly. Philip had already ordered the animal led away, but young Alexander suddenly declared that he could manage it himself. The courtiers smirked, yet the boy walked up to the horse and noticed what the grown men had not. Bucephalus was frightened by his own shadow. Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, so the shadow disappeared, calmed him, and leapt into the saddle. They say his astonished father told him then, "Son, seek out a kingdom of your own that is larger, for Macedonia is too small for you." This horse would become Alexander's faithful companion in nearly all his campaigns. Philip understood that he was raising no ordinary heir, and he resolved to give him the finest education that could exist in the ancient world. From distant Athens, he invited to his court a man whose name everyone knows today, the great philosopher Aristotle. Imagine that union. The greatest mind of the age teaching the future greatest commander. Aristotle taught the young prince philosophy and ethics, the foundations of medicine, the natural sciences, and the art of ruling. He instilled in Alexander a love of Greek culture, and especially of the poems of Homer. They say the future king carried the Iliad with him all his life and kept it under his pillow beside a dagger. From an early age, two forces joined together in his mind: the wisdom of the Hellenes and the fury of a warrior. But while young Alexander was mastering the sciences, a deadly web of intrigue was being spun at court. The Macedonian court was a cauldron of ambition, envy, and secret plots. At the center of this storm stood Alexander's mother, Queen Olympias, a woman imperious, passionate, and merciless toward her rivals. Her relations with Philip grew ever more strained, especially when the king took a new, young wife. For Olympias, and for Alexander himself, this was a direct threat. If Philip fathered another heir of pure Macedonian blood, Alexander's claims to the throne might be shaken. At one of the feasts, a quarrel flared up, during which the father, in his rage, very nearly lunged at his son with a weapon. The gulf between them widened, and a shadow of uncertainty loomed over Alexander's future. And then came the event that overturned everything in a single instant. During a lavish wedding celebration, before the eyes of the guests, King Philip was stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. The assassin was killed on the spot, and so the true reasons for the attack remained a mystery for the ages. Was it personal revenge? Or did those to whom the king's death was profitable stand behind the killer? Many suspected that the threads led to Olympias herself, and perhaps to the young heir, but no one could prove it. One thing was clear: the throne stood empty. The throne stood empty. And in that very instant, while Philip's body still lay unchilled, the vast realm he had built his whole life froze in tense silence. The 20-year-old youth who had put on the crown physically felt hostile, alien eyes fixed on him from every side. This was no metaphor. This was a deadly reality. In the mountains to the north, the Thracian and Illyrian tribes began to stir, their chieftains remembering Philip's heavy hand, and now preparing to test the mettle of his boy heir. And in the south, in the glittering Greek cities, those who had endured Macedonian rule for decades, gritting their teeth, began to raise their heads. In Athens, the famous orator Demosthenes, who had hated Macedonia all his life, openly rejoiced. He called Alexander a boy, a fool who would not dare poke his nose beyond the borders of his own kingdom. Rumors ran through the cities of Hellas. Power in Macedonia is weak. The heir is inexperienced. Now is the time to throw off the yoke. Rebellion gathered in the air like a thunderstorm. And everyone who looked at the young king asked himself a single question: the shadow of the great Philip, or a man capable of surpassing his father? Alexander answered this question faster than anyone expected. While his enemies were still merely gathering their strength and exchanging messages, he was already on the move. Lightning speed would become his signature for the rest of his life. He appeared where he was least expected, and when he was thought to be hundreds of kilometers away. First he came down upon the north, subduing the Thracians and Illyrians in a swift campaign that showed war was his native element. And then came the event that would decide the fate of one of the most ancient cities in Greece. While Alexander was fighting far to the north, a rumor swept across Hellas, the most dangerous rumor there could be. They said the king had fallen in battle with the barbarians. And that was enough. The city of Thebes, ancient, proud, remembering the days of its great glory, believed this news and rose in revolt. The Thebans besieged the Macedonian garrison stationed in the city's citadel and proclaimed their freedom. They tore up the very treaty they themselves had recognized. They raised a rebellion at the very moment when the king, as they thought, was dead, and there was no one to take revenge. But Alexander was alive, and what he did next shook the entire Greek world. Covering an enormous distance in a matter of days, he appeared beneath the walls of Thebes before the citizens could believe their own eyes. The man they had been burying stood at their gates with an army. Alexander was in no hurry. He gave the Thebans a chance. He offered them the chance to hand over the instigators of the revolt and submit. But the pride of the ancient city proved stronger than common sense. Thebes answered with refusal and defiance. The assault was terrible. The city that remembered heroes and commanders fell, and the full fury of Macedonia came crashing down upon it. The streets choked with blood. By the various reckonings of the ancient chroniclers, around 6,000 of its inhabitants were slaughtered, and those who survived, women, children, the old, more than 30,000 people were sold into slavery. The city itself, Alexander ordered razed to the ground. According to tradition, in all of Thebes, only the temples of the gods were spared, along with a single house, the house of the great poet Pindar, whom the king revered. Thus, a city with centuries of history vanished. This was not merely revenge. It was a message written in fire and blood for all of Greece. And the message was understood at once. When word of the fate of Thebes reached the other cities, terror ran through the whole Mediterranean. Athens, which only yesterday had applauded the revolt, hastily sent envoys to Alexander with congratulations and assurances of loyalty. The orators who had called for uprising fell silent. A single terrible example did what years of sieges could not. All Hellas bowed its head. The Greek cities recognized Alexander as hegemon, leader of the united campaign against the East, the very campaign that Philip had already begun to devise. No one dared strike at the Macedonian king's back any longer. Now he could turn to face his true goal. And his goal was the greatest power in the known world, the Persian Empire. A giant sprawling from Egypt to India, possessed of incalculable riches and armies that could not even be counted. And it was against this giant that the king of Little Macedonia prepared to march. In the spring of the 334th year before our era, Alexander brought his army up to the narrow strait of the Hellespont, a thin ribbon of water separating Europe from Asia. On the far side lay another world. Picture this moment. A young man stands at the border of everything he has known and everything he is destined to conquer. Behind him, his native land, familiar mountains, the life he knew. Ahead, a boundless unknown, alien peoples, alien gods, a fate that must still be wrested from the gods by force. Plutarch has preserved for us one gesture full of great meaning. When Alexander's ship drew near the Asian shore, the king took a spear and hurled it into the sand of the foreign land. The spear struck home, quivering. And with this, Alexander declared, "This land he takes as spoils won by arms, a gift of the gods, and not a present of fortune for which someone must be thanked." He stepped onto the Asian shore first, in full armor, as a warrior and not as a negotiator. The bridges were burned. There was no way back. The first trial awaited at a river called the Granicus. On the far bank, the Persian host was drawn up, ready to drown the insolent newcomers right in the water at the crossing. Experienced commanders advised Alexander to wait, not to throw himself into an attack across the river under a hail of arrows. But he would not wait. And here happened what would repeat itself again and again in his battles. He himself, personally, at the head of the cavalry, plunged into the water and up the steep enemy bank, straight into the thick of the Persian nobility. This was no calculated maneuver of a commander giving orders from afar. This was a desperate melee, face to face. Alexander could be recognized by his gleaming helmet with white plumes, and the Persians rushed straight for him. To kill the king meant to win the whole war. His spear broke in the fray. He was handed another. It broke too. All around, steel rang, splinters of shafts flew, blood drenched the water. And in one terrible moment, an enemy blade came down upon his head, shearing off part of the helmet. A second Persian had already raised his weapon for a fatal blow from behind, and at that very instant, his loyal comrade Clytus, with a single stroke, severed the enemy's arm. Alexander was a hair's breadth from death in his very first major battle. Here, in the murky water of the Granicus, he truly learned what it means to die. But he survived, and he won. The Persian host was crushed, the road deep into Asia Minor lay open, and the young king received a lesson that made him a legend in the eyes of his own soldiers. He does not hide behind their backs. He goes where he sends them, into the very inferno. Onward, Alexander led his army not blindly, but by the cold logic of a conqueror. Asia Minor was strewn with Greek cities that had long languished under the rule of Persian governors, and the king grasped a simple truth. Not every city must be taken by storm. Where they were ready to greet him as a liberator, he came in peace. Many city-states opened their gates themselves, overthrowing the Persian appointees and joyfully welcoming the Macedonians. Alexander restored their former freedoms, abolished the heavy taxes, and turned yesterday's subjects of Persia into his allies. But there were also those who resisted. Cities like Miletus, and especially Halicarnassus, where Persian forces had entrenched themselves, had to be taken in grueling sieges, with siege engines and bloody assaults. Alexander showed both sides of his nature, mercy to the submissive and ruthlessness to the stubborn. He subdued Asia Minor not only with the sword, but with his mind, understanding where it was more advantageous to negotiate and where it was necessary to instill terror. And on this path, a riddle awaited him that stirred the imagination of the ancients more than any battle. Deep in the interior, in the city of Gordium, there was kept an ancient wagon. Its yoke was bound to the shaft by a knot of incredible, unfathomable complexity, a tangle in which no beginning and no end could be found. Tied to this knot was a prophecy known throughout the East. Whoever managed to untie it would become the lord of all Asia. Alexander entered the temple where the wagon was kept. A crowd gathered around. The local priests, the nobility, his own warriors. Everyone waited. No one had managed to untie this knot for many generations. The king studied the tangle for a long time, searching for the hidden ends of the rope. What happened next, historians argue to this day. By one account, he impatiently drew his sword and with a single stroke cleaved the knot in two. By another, he found a clever way to loosen it. But that is not the point. The point is that after this day, people began to look upon Alexander differently. He ceased to be merely a lucky young commander. The prophecy had named him the future lord of Asia, and more people began to believe that before them stood not an ordinary man, but one chosen by fate. Thus was born an expression that lives on to this day: to cut the Gordian knot, to find a bold solution where others see only a dead end. And ahead of Alexander awaited a meeting he had been anticipating from the very start of the campaign. The Persian king, ruler of half the known world, at last came out to meet him himself. In the autumn of the 333rd year, the two armies collided on a narrow field near a place called Issus, hemmed in between the sea and the mountains. Here Alexander was awaited by Darius III himself, King of Kings, Lord of Persia. And he had brought with him a host at the sight of which any heart would falter. The ancient sources claimed the Persians outnumbered them tenfold, hundreds of thousands of warriors, an avalanche that, it seemed, should simply have swept away the handful of Macedonians. Historians today dispute this and cite a more modest ratio, closer to 3-1. But even so, the Persian advantage was enormous. And in the eyes of contemporaries and descendants, Alexander was working nothing less than a miracle, overcoming an enemy 10 times his strength. And here, on this narrow field, fate played into Alexander's hands. Darius had chosen a place where his countless host simply could not deploy. Mountains on one side, the sea on the other, this whole mass found itself squeezed into a cramped space, where numbers turned from an advantage into a hindrance. The Persians crowded together, getting in one another's way, unable to envelop their opponent on the flanks. Alexander swept his gaze across the battlefield and saw what decided everything. Far off, in the very center of the Persian line, atop a high golden chariot, rose Darius, King of Kings, surrounded by his finest warriors, gleaming in sumptuous raiment. And in that instant, Alexander understood the main thing. Victory lay not in maneuvers on the flanks, not in a long, exhausting slaughter. Victory was over there, in that chariot. If he could reach Darius, the Persian army, however enormous it was, would collapse in a single moment. And he led the cavalry straight there. In a wedge, its point aimed at the heart of the enemy line, the Macedonians cut into the Persian ranks, hacking closer and closer to the golden chariot. Around Alexander, the finest warriors of Darius fell, standing to the death before their lord. This was no battle of armies. It was a personal duel of two kings, toward which Alexander tore through a wall of bodies and steel. He was wounded in the thigh, but did not stop. Closer, just a little more, and Darius could not hold. The ruler of the greatest empire in the world, surrounded by his finest bodyguards, saw this frenzied Macedonian in blood-soaked armor hacking his way straight toward him, and his nerve gave way. The King of Kings turned his chariot and fled. He abandoned his host, abandoned his tent, abandoned even his own family, mother, wife, children, leaving everything to the mercy of the victor. This was more than a military defeat. It was the psychological collapse of the entire empire. When the vast Persian host saw that their divine lord was fleeing the field, all its countless might crumbled into panic. Hundreds of thousands of warriors turned to flight, trampling and crushing one another. And into Alexander's hands fell an incredible prize, including the captured royal family, with whom, to his credit, the victor dealt with a nobility rare for that age. And so, the whole eastern Mediterranean now lay under Alexander's power. Darius had fled deep into his realm, defeated and humiliated. One might think it was time to celebrate, but the young king looked not back, but forward, and he saw a serious problem. Along the coast stretched a chain of powerful seaside cities, centers of all eastern trade, from which the Persian fleet could still strike him in the back. To truly secure the victory, he had to go farther, south. There, where beyond the ancient cities of the Phoenicians lay a land that guarded the treasures of the pharaohs and the key to mastery over the entire known world. There, where Egypt awaited him. The south beckoned not with gold. The south was a necessity. Alexander stood before a problem that no previous conqueror had been able to solve. The Persian fleet, vast and formidable, still dominated the sea, and as long as the coastal cities of Phoenicia remained in its hands, ancient, wealthy ports from which the finest ships in the world had sailed for centuries, Alexander could not feel secure. Enemy squadrons could land troops in his rear, raise a revolt in Greece, cut his supply lines. There was no going around these cities. They had to be taken, every single one. Most of the Phoenician cities opened their gates themselves, acknowledging the new lord. But one stood in Alexander's way like a wall. Ancient, proud, impregnable, Tyre. This city was built so as to seem invulnerable. It stood on an island, separated from the mainland by nearly a kilometer of seawater. Mighty walls rose straight from the waves. Tyre had its own fleet, its own stores, its own centuries-old faith in its own invincibility. The Tyrians refused Alexander and barred their gates, certain that beyond the water they were safe. Alexander accepted the challenge, and what he did next went down in history as one of the greatest engineering feats of antiquity. Having no fleet with which to storm the island, he decided to reach the city another way, to build a road across the sea. Thousands of men began to raise a causeway, a mole, leading from the mainland straight to the walls of Tyre. Into the water they hurled stones, timber, the rubble of old buildings. The sea fought back. Storms washed away what had been built. The defenders showered the builders with arrows and burning missiles from their ships. But the causeway crept forward, meter by meter, inexorably drawing nearer to the doomed city. The siege lasted 7 long months. 7 months of fury, ingenuity, and desperation on both sides. The Tyrians burned the siege towers, drowned the builders, devised ever new methods of defense. Inside the city, famine gradually set in, and Alexander, having at last gathered the ships of his allies, blockaded the island from the sea as well. When the mole was completed and the walls breached from several sides at once, the final assault began. The Macedonians, embittered by 7 months of losses, burst into the city and knew no mercy. Thousands of defenders were cut down in the street fighting, and afterward, a cruel reprisal that became a lesson for the whole Mediterranean. Around 2,000 surviving warriors were crucified along the shore, and the women and children, tens of thousands, were sold into slavery. Tyre, which had stood for centuries, was broken, and all the rest of the world understood. Before Alexander, even those whom the gods, it seemed, had protected with the very sea, could not stand. And then, an abrupt change of scene. After the blood and horror of the sieges, Alexander entered Egypt, and here he was met quite differently. The Egyptians, who for centuries had suffered under the rule of the Persians, saw in the Macedonian not a conqueror, but a liberator. The ancient land of the pharaohs opened its arms to him without a single battle. Priests, common people, nobility, all hailed Alexander as a deliverer from the hated Persian yoke. He did not destroy their temples, he honored their gods. And Egypt crowned him as pharaoh, successor to the ancient lords of this land. But the most important thing happened in the desert. Alexander set out on a perilous journey across the sands to the distant oasis of Siwa, where stood the famous oracle of the god Amon. What exactly he heard there in the silence of the sanctuary remained a secret. But according to tradition, the priest greeted Alexander as the son of a god, the son of Amon, whom the Greeks identified with their own Zeus. And this became a turning point, not so much for the world as for Alexander himself. The young king began to believe that not only human blood flowed in his veins, that he was not merely a lucky commander, but something greater, a being marked by the gods themselves. This belief would grow in him with each new victory, and in the end would change him as neither power nor wealth could. And meanwhile, Darius was not sitting idle. The King of Kings was gathering all that still remained to his giant empire. He summoned warriors from all its boundless reaches, from the mountains of Central Asia to the shores of India. And in the autumn of the 331st year before our era, the two armies met on a broad plain called Gaugamela. Here, Darius had prepared thoroughly. This time there would be no narrow field to constrain his forces. He chose an open plain where his countless host could deploy to its full breadth. He even ordered the ground leveled to bring into play his terrible weapon, chariots with scythes on their wheels, capable of ripping through whole ranks of infantry. The Persians were monstrously numerous. The ancients speak of 1,000,000, and though this is an exaggeration, Darius's army vastly outnumbered Alexander's forces. The Macedonians stood before this sea of enemies, and many of the commanders advised Alexander to attack at night, under cover of darkness, to conceal his small numbers. The king refused. He would not steal a victory like a thief. He proudly declared that he would not win by stealth. And on the eve of the decisive battle, to the amazement of his companions, Alexander slept a deep sleep. So calm was he in his faith in destiny. The Battle of Gaugamela became a masterpiece of the art of war. Alexander did not try simply to crush the Persians head-to-head. That would have been suicide. He devised a daring plan. He began to draw his cavalry off to the right, stretching out the Persian line, forcing Darius to send troops after him so as not to be outflanked. And in this stretched-out line of the enemy, a breach gradually formed, a gap directly opposite the very place where Darius himself stood. This was exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. At the right moment, he turned his elite cavalry into a wedge and struck into this gap, once more hacking his way straight toward the chariot of the King of Kings. And history repeated itself. Darius, seeing death rushing upon him, once again could not hold. Once again, he turned his chariot and fled the field of battle, abandoning his greatest army. The Persian Empire, which had stood for 200 years, which had ruled half the known world, fell on this day. The road to the very heart of the realm, to its fabulous capitals, lay open. Alexander entered Babylon, entered Susa, seized the untold treasures of the Persian kings, gold that had been amassed over generations. He became the Lord of Asia, just as the Gordian knot had foretold. And then he came to Bucephalus, the sacred capital of the Persians, the symbol of their greatness and pride. And here happened what darkened his glory. The magnificent palace of the Persian kings, a wonder of the ancient world, was given over to fire. Some say this was revenge for the Athens burned by the Persians many decades earlier. Others, that it all happened during a drunken feast, when a crowd, maddened by wine, set the palace ablaze almost as a jest. The flames devoured one of the greatest monuments of antiquity, and soon came news of Darius himself. The fugitive King of Kings had perished, but not in battle, at the hands of his own attendants, who had betrayed and killed him. Alexander found only the body of his great adversary. They say he mourned Darius and ordered him buried with royal honors, the enemy he had chased across half the world. But from this moment, a change began to take place in Alexander that split his own people. The conqueror of Persia was coming more and more to resemble a Persian ruler. He put on Eastern garments, surrounded himself with the lavish ceremonial of the Persian court. He began to demand that people prostrate themselves before him, a custom unthinkable for free Greeks and Macedonians, who saw in their king the first among equals, not a living god. He married Eastern princesses, brought Persians into his army and into command positions. For Alexander, this was wise policy. To rule the conquered peoples, one had to become one of them as well. But his old comrades, the veterans who had marched thousands of kilometers with him, seethed with indignation. Their king, their brother in arms, was turning into an Eastern despot. A dull discontent grew. Quarrels and plots flared up. And once, at a feast, in a drunken rage, Alexander with his own hand killed Clytus, the very man who had once saved his life at the river Granicus. In the morning, the king was crushed by grief. Power and the belief in his own divinity were beginning to devour him. But he could no longer stop. Ahead lay the edge of the world, or so at least the ancients thought. Alexander led his army ever farther east, into mysterious India. Here awaited him lands of which the Greeks knew only from legends. Here were impassable jungles, beasts never seen before, and peoples who had never heard of Macedonia. And here he met one of his most worthy opponents, the Indian king Porus. On the bank of the river Hydaspes, there broke out a battle unlike anything before. Against the Macedonians, Porus fielded war elephants, huge, terrifying animals that Alexander's horses feared to the point of madness. The elephants trampled the infantry, lifted men with their trunks, sowed chaos and panic. This was the hardest, bloodiest clash. But even here, Alexander found a solution, wearing down and surrounding the enemy. Porus was defeated, but fought to the last and was taken prisoner, wounded. When he was brought before the victor, Alexander asked how he should be treated. Porus answered proudly, "As a king treats a king." And Alexander, admiring his courage, restored his kingdom to him. Even here, at the edge of the earth, he knew how to value greatness in others. But it was precisely in India that the great campaign reached its limit. Not the Persians, not the elephants, not the enemy armies stopped Alexander. His own soldiers stopped him. At the river Hyphasis, the army simply refused to go farther. The veterans had marched tens of thousands of kilometers with the king. They had not seen their homeland for long years. They were weary, worn out. They had lost comrades. And ahead, by rumor, lay lands still more distant and fearsome. Alexander begged them, appealed to their glory, to their dream of the edge of the world. He even shut himself in his tent in anger and hurt. But this time, the king's will was broken, against the will of his men. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to retreat. The dream of reaching the very edge of the earth collapsed. The way back became a new nightmare. Alexander led part of the army through the scorched desert of Gedrosia, and this decision turned into a catastrophe. There was no water, there was no food. The sun killed men by the thousands. Soldiers who had passed through all the battles of the world were dying in the sands from thirst and heat. They say that once, when a warrior brought him a helmet with a precious drop of water, Alexander poured it out onto the ground before everyone's eyes. He would not drink if his men could not drink. But the desert took more lives than all the battles of his campaign. From this crossing, there emerged only the shadow of a once great army. And then there was Babylon, the greatest city in the world, where Alexander was making grandiose plans, new campaigns, new conquests, an unheard-of fleet, the union of West and East into a single realm. He was only 32 years old, and the whole world, it seemed, lay at his feet. But in the summer of the 323rd year before our era, Alexander suddenly fell ill. A fever set in. Day by day, it burned him from within. The greatest conqueror in history, ruler of half the known world, weakened before everyone's eyes. Poison? Illness? The consequences of old wounds and endless feasts? Historians argue about it to this day. Only one thing is clear. The body that had marched 40,000 kilometers, endured dozens of wounds, and known no rest for 13 years, at last gave out. A few days later, Alexander of Macedon was no more. They say that when the dying king was asked to whom he was leaving his empire, he answered with a single word: to the strongest. And this word became the death sentence for everything he had built. No sooner had he closed his eyes than his commanders, yesterday's brothers in arms, were at one another's throats. The greatest power in history, stretching from Greece to India, created by one man in 13 years, began to fall apart in that same instant. The generals divided the provinces, warred against one another, killed Alexander's heirs, his mother, his wives, his little son. Within a few decades, the single empire had broken up into warring kingdoms. Alexander's dream of a single realm uniting all peoples evaporated, like water in the sands of Gedrosia. And in this lies the most bitter and the most magnificent lesson of his whole life. The man who considered himself the son of a god, who passed where no one had passed before, who redrew the map of the known world and subdued the greatest empire of antiquity, could not hold on to his dream even until his own funeral. His body had not yet grown cold, and what he had created was already crumbling. Empires fall. Gold flows out among the hands of strangers. Even the strongest are mortal. All that remained was a name: Alexander the Great, which lives on in our memory 23 centuries after his own age went dark. Perhaps in this lies true immortality, not in the stone of palaces and not in the borders of states, which time erases, but in the story that people tell one another thousands of years later. His campaigns gave rise to the age of Hellenism, that very cultural revolution when Greek and Eastern traditions merged into a new whole. When new cities arose, connections between different peoples, trade expanded, the sciences and arts flourished. If this story made you reflect on what remains of a man after all his victories have gone dark, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Here we tell of people who dared to change the world, and of the price they paid for it. And in the comments, write, what do you think? Was Alexander truly great, or was it merely a brilliance doomed to fade? Ahead of us await new great destinies.